Construction is one of Ontario's most important economic engines. It builds our homes, our hospitals, our transit systems, and the infrastructure that keeps our communities moving. But it's also one of the most complex and ever-changing industries in the province. That's why good public policy in construction can't be created in isolation. Advisory councils play a critical role in bridging the gap between government intent and on-the-ground reality. They bring together industry leaders, employers, workers, and subject matter experts who understand how policy decisions translate into real projects and real outcomes. When governments have access to expertise early and consistently, policy is stronger, more practical, and far more likely to succeed. Industry input is about making policies workable, efficient, and aligned with the realities of today's construction sector. Without that input, well-intentioned regulations can unintentionally increase costs, create delays, and add administrative burden without delivering better results. At a time when Ontario is facing unprecedented demand for housing, infrastructure, and skilled labor, efficiency matters. Regulatory reviews must strike the right balance between protecting safety and public interest while avoiding unnecessary complexity that creates barriers to productivity and innovation. Buy-in from industry isn't a nice to have, it's essential. When the construction sector understands the why behind a policy and has had a meaningful role in shaping it, implementation is smoother, compliance is higher, and outcomes are better for everyone. In today's episode, we're joined by Marc Arsenault, Business Manager of the Provincial Building and Construction Trades Council of Ontario, Enzo Garritano, President and CEO of the Infrastructure Health and Safety Association, and Robert Love, Vice President of Project Support Services at Alberici Constructors. Today, we're exploring why advisory councils matter, how effective collaboration between government and industry leads to better regulation, and what it takes to ensure Ontario's construction policies remain responsive, practical, and future-ready.
Welcome to OCS Talks, your source for all things related to Ontario's unionized ICI construction sector.
I'm Brian Barron, CEO of the Ontario Construction Secretariat. Gentlemen, welcome. And thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
You're welcome.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Brian.
So each of you guys have been involved in advisory capacities from your different perspectives at different times throughout your career. You're also, all three of you are very respected in the industry. Your input and involvement has been really kind of very much appreciated right across the board. So, the reason that I brought you guys on was really to kind of take a look at sort of, this topic of advisory councils from your respective perspectives, labor, or Marc, you from the labor perspective, Robert, you from the employer perspective, and then Enzo from the association side of things. So I'm going to start off with sort of a question to all of you. And it really comes down to, from your respective perspectives, why are advisory councils and structured industry government tables so important when governments are developing a review and construction policy? So, Marc, I'll start with you. If you want to just kind of quickly give sort of your thoughts on it.
Oh, thanks, Brian. And I would say from a labor perspective, there's nuances. There's nuances in terms of the various things that would happen in a civil, mechanical, electrical component. And it's the practical application of what is it that we're trying to solve and how is it that that our solutions are going to apply with the boots on the ground to improve efficiencies, improve safety, and to essentially in that continual pursuit of professionalizing our industry. These advisory groups have the ability to unpack those nuances so that the practical application is making those improvements rather than adding a burden, if you will, to the execution of the work.
It's really that on the ground kind of application of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish, right? It's understanding kind of the impact on the individual trades, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So Robert, from an employer perspective, what are kind of the, like where's the value here?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And Marc, you brought up some great points. From my perspective, advisory councils matter because policy only works if it can actually be built, right? The construction policy doesn't succeed on paper. It succeeds or fails in the field. So while the government may set the goals, it's the industry that understands the real world constraints as it applies to labor, materials, timelines, costs. So when we're at the table, the policies are more likely to be practical. I think, Marc, that's the word you use is practical. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to be more likely to succeed. Moreover, it builds alignment which is critical for delivering the number of complex projects that we have on the go right now.
Yeah, for sure. When you take a look at sort of the impact, and we've certainly seen our fair share of regulations. So whether it's regulation or legislation that's come into play, it really is that, it equates to dollars on the ground, right? Like, and not that should always be the driving factor, but the fact is done incorrectly, there's a massive cost to some of these changes that happen out there. So having that employer input and understanding how that impacts the overall cost of the product is going to be a huge impact. Enzo, you head up the organization that actually kind of facilitates the largest advisory council that's out there, the Section 21 committee,
Right.
Geared towards health and safety. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on it.
Yeah, efficiency is important. Effectiveness is important. Having that bipartite input, though, is critical. I mean, having both parties providing their subject matter expertise on both sides is critical to success and buy-in. I mean, the buy-in when industry knows, the workers know, the other employers know across the province that they've arrived at a consensus in regards to a certain requirement, practice, legislation, whatever the case is, they're going to move forward, collectively with that. The other piece that's really important is the regional aspect of getting input at advisory tables. In our case with our Section 21 or our construction provincial committees, we've got representation not only from all the different sectors and bipartite, but it's also regional, right? We've got regional input when we go out to our labor management network to get input and feedback from. So the nuances, to your point, Mark, are not only specific to sector, but specific to region sometimes. And if we don't have that viewpoint and that input, then things, might get somewhat derailed when you have to apply it in different regions for very good reason as well. So having those elements in place, and this isn't something new. This has been around in our case since 1968. They recognized, labor and management recognized in 1968 that in order to be successful in health and safety, in this case, you have to get together and have both sides agree on a path, and the buy-in follows that very specifically. So really important. The subject matter expertise, again, is something you can't understate in both the management side and the labor side.
And I think that's a really important part. I mean, when we take a look at that buy-in, recommendations that go up to the government from these advisory councils, where you've got both labor and management who have bought into it, they agree and everything else, you can really kind of take that to the bank. That is something where both perspectives have been considered. There's been agreement from both parties to go forward to say, hey, we want to make the system better. And you've really kind of got that push behind it. I think the other piece too is when we take a look at the association perspective, it's really kind of understanding, well, what can we also do that the association really plays that role of helping to support whatever that policy change is going to be in a way that people can understand. I mean, for the people who have actually kind of read, an act or a regulation, it can be really difficult to understand how to apply that to the work that you're doing. And associations like yours, Enzo, really help to promote that sort of thing. They put it into layperson's terms. In a lot of cases, they'll actually put sort of like pictures around it to say, well, this is what compliance actually looks like. So it's really kind of having sort of that third party come in as well to say, how does this actually apply and how can we communicate that out to folks as well?
And there's one other point there, and it's not done in a vacuum with only labor and management. The input from obviously the government and the policy folks and the ones who write up the legal requirements per se in a regulatory language makes the system work much better when it's done in three ways there. The stakeholders plus the government folks who may not have the practical, but have the understanding of what's required on their end, whether it's for enforcement purposes or whether it's for clarity and completeness, close the gaps. So again, it's a really good example of a team environment where the government is a critical element as well as the other two parties when it comes to regulatory reform or creating policy.
It's interesting. So having come from the government, 21 years in the government, and I was the government representative that sat on the Section 21 committee. It's kind of interesting because there's a different viewpoint coming in from government because you have to look at it from enforceability. So regardless of what policy you're putting into place, it's trying to understand, well, how is that going to impact the industry? But then how is government going to make sure that it can be enforced, so that there's some teeth behind whatever it is they're putting in place, making sure that people can actually, that they're ultimately benefiting from whatever the intent was behind that change. So there's always kind of like that back piece from the government looking in, going, okay, that's great, we understand what the intent is, but how do we actually build this in a way that, yeah, we can follow up and make sure it's being done as well, right? So there's always these kind of competing things that come in, which is, I think, where we see, I don't want to say disconnect because it's probably the wrong word, but you can certainly see this kind of issue where intent sort of almost looks a little bit different at times when it comes out in the actual legislation or the regulation. So
Brian, if I can interrupt you there, though, that is exactly why it is so important to have all the parties at the table. There's no better group to challenge those assumptions, to test those theories and the practicality of it than having everyone together discussing in advance, right?
Well, and it's interesting when you look at sort of like the transparency side of things at these tables, and you're having these open and honest discussions around it. That's ultimately where you hash out a lot of these details, right? Like when you're dealing with something that could impact, a particular trade or, a subsector of construction, it's important to understand, what that impact is going to be. And that advisory council, it's really kind of that safe space where you can explore the different options as to which way you go, so that you do understand really kind of what the impact is going to be. So I want to shift gears for just kind of a bit of a second when we look at this. So construction has changed. Like when I left construction, actually building things in 2004, and I went to the government, big jobs were in the hundreds of millions of dollars, that kind of stuff. Like I remember doing a hospital for $300 million and thinking, man, that is a big job. Like this is something, that you don't see every day. Now we're talking multi-billions of dollars. Like there are mega projects coming in. We've got international investors. We've got new technology coming in. We've got wildly complicated pieces of equipment. Building things yesterday at one of our courses, I was just being shown, a lift that was being done where it was this 200-foot steel base for one of the SMRs out at Darlington being dropped into place. And you see the size of this crane that's doing the work. We're looking at things on a totally different scale that we've never sort of seen before. And I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on, how the regulations kind of keep up with this sort of thing. I mean, it's not easy to keep up. The change in the demographics, the different influences that we're getting from different countries coming in and that sort of stuff. So why is it critical that we have a formal voice, from each of your perspectives in advisory councils during these types of reviews where there is that new technology coming in? So, Marc, let's start with you.
Sure, Brian. And I think the small modular reactor project that you mentioned is a good example of where there was early engagement and there was often engagement with a three-way intersection, as Enzo and Robert indicated, to build that collaboration, build that trust, to be able to recognize that we need to plan this work different from the way that we've planned work in the past to mitigate project risks. And so this is where, well in advance of the project, a certain framework or structure for the employers, for the owner, for labor, and in some cases, it's a four-way intersection that includes government, come together, identify the risks, identify what it is that collectively we're trying to solve, and then put those pieces in place with that subject matter expertise so that the practical application is going to work in the field. Because once the project starts, that's it. The opportunity to discuss progressive ideas is pretty much at an end. The project started, we're focused on the work, the safe execution of the work. This needs to start well in advance of the project, and I've seen that well executed in certain sectors and in certain industries, if you will, where the recognition of improving the way that we plan the work is going to produce safer, on time, on budget outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at these complicated relationships between all the parties coming in. You got a lot of money on the table. You got a lot of equipment and a lot of complexity, and in some cases, projects that have never been done before, right? So you're sort of exploring this. So sitting down well ahead of time to really understand what the impact of legislation and regulation is going to be on that type of thing is going to be really critical. Robert, what are your thoughts? You guys have been involved in some large international projects and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's Mark, again, I think you brought up some good points there. Construction is it's a massive ecosystem, right? Bringing together owners and contractors, and labor, of course, with design consultants and complex joint venture relationships. I would echo what Mark said. The importance of planning is huge. People's motivations and mindsets change once you actually hit boots on the ground stage, and we're out there doing and executing, and it becomes increasingly more difficult to pause and reflect and course correct. So the diligence we can have, or the effort we put into planning up front, is absolutely going to pay dividends when it comes time to execute the work.
Yeah, definitely. And so what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what resonated with me was when Mark said, the building of trust amongst parties. I think that's a really important element, that workers are at the table and having those that input in the processes, in what's being done, how it's being done, the nuances with language barriers and issues of that nature that they can, again, bring up forward early in the process to identify, where are those challenges, where are those risks, and how are we going to work on them together? Because once you build that trust, now they know they're not a commodity, right? Workers aren't commodities, all right? You got to get in there and you've got to be a valued partner in the process. And what better builds it than to have their input and to have their perspective on how they're going to do the work and how they're going to get home safe at night. So I think allowing them to feel comfortable that all these things that we're working together on in open dialogue will lead us to enjoy our weekends, right? And I think that's an important part, both on the mental health side and mental perspective as well, of going to work every day and making sure that you and your colleagues go home. So again, that collective work is critical in building that trust. And thanks for using that word, because I think that's the important piece.
And that's getting that worker input. It is so frustrating when, at least from my perspective, when we try and force rules on the workforce, on the men and women who we rely on to execute and deliver every single day. And if you can engage your labor, if you can engage your workers, and develop that ownership, I think it's tremendously impactful to supporting safe outcomes.
I'll say, so even in my opening where I talk about the why, right? Like it's, why is this happening kind of thing, and getting that early buy-in, you're far more likely to get compliance, right? Like people are going to come along for the ride when they understand the reasoning behind it versus just being told because I said so, right? Like, I mean, it just doesn't work very well when we look at it from that perspective. So when we take a look at, and I want to sort of jump over a little bit here. So we've all been involved where consultations have come out. I think the government genuinely wants to have longer periods of time where people have time to kind of mull it over, try to figure out sort of what's happening and that kind of stuff. But there's sometimes some urgency behind the consultation. The government has to balance really kind of whatever the public need is with the regulation of the legislation. So from your perspective, I want to understand, from an advisory council perspective, does early engagement through these councils actually help the government to move faster versus slower? So, like Mark, let's start with you again. We'll just kind of stay with the same process.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. You made a good point there about the public, right? And I've seen, I've had an opportunity to work with some fantastic folks that are 2 or 3 layers removed from the construction industry at a 4-way intersection, where the employers, the unions, government, and the community were at the 4-way intersection, and they were successful with influencing legislation, the Infrastructure for Jobs Prosperity Act, that had a really robust pieces in there, that there was a what's in it for everyone, and the government in an urgency to get something in place When that trust is built and you can essentially pick up the phone with folks that have experience working on these advisory groups, convene the meetings quickly, and there's action items for them to go back to their broader group of stakeholders to come back to a second meeting with here's what's going to work, here's what we need to do a little bit better. That can be done. And that can be done when, if there's urgency, there's a relationship with government, that industry and the community have experience working on these advisory groups. They can quickly be convened and they can identify, align on what it is that they're trying to solve. And amongst their various ecosystems and networks that they all come from, be able to go back to those folks, do a verification check, and be able to report back to the industry group and do the best you can to mitigate project risks. And where it is that maybe something got missed, you still have that trust that you can come together to make some improvements or tweaks or modifications along the way.
I think that's a really important point. And I think one of the things that we really should kind of tease out a little bit here is that concept of trust, that relationship, right? And that's something that's not built overnight. That is something where when you've got this longstanding sort of relationship around advisory councils, where you can go to that group, you can get that, that advice at really any time. I think there's a huge value to that, and when we look at those consultations, now there's going to be exceptions to what I'm saying here, but ideally, what we would love to see with that consultation is that's something we've already had our eyes on. So before it goes to the regulatory registry, it's something that the industry has already had input and, really a role in helping to shape. But then when that consultation comes out, it's a matter of, really kind of, digging deep and looking for where those areas are that might be somewhat problematic. Now, the exception to that is COVID. When we saw COVID, where suddenly you've got this wide sweeping regulatory and in some cases legislative change that comes out where it was happening overnight. I was at the government for 21 years and it was kind of like regulatory and legislative change takes years to do. And we were doing it in hours, and coming out where it's like, hey, stuff's rolling over quickly. So in some cases, yeah, you may not have that role in helping to form whatever that change is, but having that trusting relationship where you can give that advice back to the government saying, hey, what you guys are proposing could potentially cause a major issue for us, and here's where it is. That's where that relationship becomes really important, I think. So, Robert, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, consultation takes time. There's no question. And in a system with a lot of bureaucracy, it can feel like it does slow things down. I think in the reality, though, in construction, skipping that early input, as we've been talking about, is just going to create bigger delays later on. The way to combat it, from my perspective, isn't less consultation. It's better, earlier, and more focused engagement where we can really define the problem we're trying to solve. If we can be disciplined about timelines, disciplined about decision criteria, it's going to help. We talked a lot about trust and relationships. Yeah, it's pulling the right decision makers at the right time together to solve a focus problem. So yeah, it does take effort to do it right up front. But in our industry, that's what's going to save time. It's what's going to save lives. It's what's going to save money over the life of a project.
It's interesting that you bring up sort of that, really having sort of the why behind something happening, really defining that problem and that sort of stuff. And I think the industry, through the Section 21 committee and through the leadership at IHSA, they've done a really good job in the needs analysis and that sort of stuff. There's been leaps and bounds made as to forming sort of really what is the problem we're trying to solve, so that there's really that solid understanding. And I saw firsthand multiple times, in fact, where, changes we were looking at making them and trying to go back and understand sort of what the history behind some of the existing regulations or legislation really was. And you're having to call retired people and go, does anybody remember why this happened? Like, we can't really figure out why it happened, what the value of it was. Because, we evolve, right? Like, we think about things differently as time goes on, and without having really that defined problem that you're working from, or sort of a common understanding, you suddenly go, well, why is this important? Kind of thing. So, and that comes from the industry. It really does. So, Enzo, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a really big subject, and certainly that early engagement is critical, and it also leads to helping establish priorities. I mean, through our CLRC, our Construction Legislative Review Committee, you go through a whole bunch of different questions, different rationale as to why you're bringing this subject up. Look, we all know government hears a lot and is approached a lot with regards to changes or ideas, initiatives that can make things better. But the reality of it is, I think getting the early intervention or early engagement with industry helps through, like the Legislative Review Committee, having both parties there really establishes, what is the priority? Is that really is what the government is hearing from, interested parties or other parties really resonate with the industry itself in a labor and management kind of collective? Where does it sit in the priority list? Should we be focusing our energies here, or should we be focusing our energies on something that's going to result in a better outcome because of illness or injury that's immediate of concern? So having that is really important to establish priority, and as well establish really credibility of the process. Because once you start to go down the road of not having a process around it, people start to scratch their heads and say, why is that subject going forward versus one that's hurting, making people sick every day? So helping to establish priority is important. The other piece, I'd say, the early engagement. What's the old saying? I think we all agree, measure twice, cut once, right? If you don't do that, you might get back to the drawing table once you release something as government. If government's creating something in the back rooms and comes out without that early engagement, they might have to start over once they hear from the industry what the reality is of what they produced. So that can really make the system drag on, or the process drag on, versus early engagement, establish priority, establish the need, get that early input from subject matter experts, and help craft a proposal that makes sense. And then when it does go to public review, it'll be so much more seamless. Plus, again, through our network in the Section 21, you've got the regional input as well, through all the regional committees as well as the trade committees. And if you think about timelines, except for something like COVID, where it's a really quick turnaround, a regulation generally stands for years, right? A change. So is an extra month of consultation really going to take away from the end outcome? Not really, when the thing is going to last 5 to 10, maybe 15 years. So I think we all have to kind of look at it from that perspective as well, that window, to say, if you want a good output or outcome, you got to have some good input. And that might take a month, might take 2. And that shouldn't really take away from the process or cut it down.
I think it's that investment in time right up front, right? To really understand where we're going with it and the problem that we're ultimately trying to solve. I like how you brought up sort of the priority side of things. I mean, I think one of the downsides to kind of having a democratic process is you've got elected officials where everybody kind of wants to get the ear of kind of that minister. They want to talk about things that are sort of, that are problematic for them in their respective industries and that kind of stuff. And I think it's a tough role that the government plays in trying to make everybody happy. And I think when we take a look at each one of those things, and not to say that the individual issues aren't important, because they certainly are to whoever it is that's talking to the minister. But when we look at the weight and the power of an advisory committee, where they're looking at the industry as a whole, and they're looking at sort of the needs of the many versus the needs of the few, and saying what has sort of the biggest bang for the buck, I think that's really where those advisory councils come in, is they've got the ability to kind of weigh out what are truly the really big issues, what are the big game changers for the industry, and how can we make the biggest impact possible. And I think one of the things for me, and at least when I was at the government, one of my big frustrations certainly was, you've got these advisory committees where people were bringing a ton of knowledge to it. They're trying to look at it from every sort of perspective. And then you were constantly sort of fighting this other kind of, this other influence coming in from sort of another side to the government saying, hey, you know what I'd really love? I'd love to have this kind of thing. So I want to get back to kind of the value of kind of that industry buy-in piece, because I don't think we can understate the value of that. We talked about it a little bit around kind of having both that labor and management perspective, but I'm wondering if we can dig sort of a little bit deeper into kind of the process around that buy-in from each party, because I'm not sure that folks understand kind of the types of discussions that happen at these committee level meetings. and kind of that back and forth between management and labor. So, Marc, when we look at sort of that labor perspective, and when somebody's proposing some sort of a change, what's your view on that? Like, what kind of lens are you attaching to that when you're in a committee or a council?
Right. I would say, Brian, that, I can reference some specific examples or lived experience where if we miss this part, it falls flat. In terms of, let me say it this way. If the first time that you're meeting your employer partner or your owner client, let's just be honest, the largest consumer of construction services is the provincial government, right? It's Infrastructure Ontario. It's the Ministry of Energy. If the first time that you're meeting with them is when there's a problem, you're kind of a few steps back. If there is a relationship with them around showing up, and when you show up, you bring your industry partners with you. And that's kind of a thing that the Ontario Building Trades and the Construction Employers Coordinating Council of Ontario have done over the last several years, is that we have a mutual understanding that if we're going to go and see a minister, or we're going to go and see government, or we're going to go and see a mega project owner, we're going to go in there together. We're going to go in there together. We're going to develop a relationship that it's in advance of issues that may arise on the project. So I would just say, Brian, that there's a responsibility from the employer side and a responsibility from the labor side that on behalf of the collective, you've consulted with them all, and you have the ability to understand whether it's regionally specific or it's project specific or whatever that case may be, that you targeted the right audience. Our office likes to take an approach of civil, mechanical, and electrical. That's how your board has been set up for 30 years, Brian, where we have equal representation from those three pieces. When we develop a construction industry advisory group, we take the same playbook and we apply it that way. And we have subject matter expertise from those three disciplines. And so going out, connecting with the right people from labor, consulting with your employer partner, and going in and meeting with owner clients or ministers, there should be an expectation and trust that homework or those consultations were done prior to getting in there. Because if you miss that, and somehow I miss someone consulting on, hey, what are your thoughts here on this challenge? How would we solve that? What's the practical application look like? If we miss that, that could be damaging to being recognized as showing up with all of your homework done. And that's not the professional industry. That's not how we do things. We make sure that we get that right.
I love that. It's kind of like that, the knowledge is power side of things, right? Like where it's, listen, how many problems could be solved with just sort of talking through that misunderstanding, right? Like everybody's kind of got their perspectives that they come in without understanding the other person's side of things, and having that productive conversation. And that only happens in that group environment, right? Like when you're laying all your cards on the table kind of thing from everybody's perspective, saying, here's where I see some challenges. That's where you're actually able to have those productive discussions, not in isolation of one another. So yeah, and I really like that. Robert, from the employer perspective, what's kind of your thoughts around sort of that industry buy-in, the value behind it, some of those challenges that you guys may bring to the table?
What I love right now is that this isn't a win-lose type situation, right? The industry is moving away from, in order for me to win, you have to lose, and that's fantastic. We're starting to approach it much more from I know that word collaboration is a big buzzword in the industry right now, but it's true, right? It is looking for win-win scenarios. It is understanding what is important to the other party, and trying to find a solution that we all walk away happy. We understand what is important to our clients. They understand what's important to us as contractors. We understand what the constraints are, and the issues are that are important to labor. And we approach this with a partnership mentality, right? In order for this to work, it relies on all of us working together. It doesn't work if one person is left out, or they don't have the proverbial seat at the table, so to speak. It's just so critical to make sure that we understand what's important to each other and we look for ways to mutually succeed.
Well, like it is, right? Like it's like you look at it, like whether you're talking about, working with the government or working with a client, that sort of stuff, all of us want to come forward and just come away with something that works, right? Like, I mean, like you don't want to turn around and say, hey, I want to benefit, but unfortunately, client, your project's going to suck a little bit, sort of thing. Like nobody wants that. Like everybody wants to go forward and say, hey, how do we make this as successful as possible? And those types of discussions have to be had. Something can't just be thrust upon you without any sort of a discussion that's out there. And I think that's where that labor and management buy-in, two of you guys coming together to whether it is that owner client or to the government, that's where there's just a lot of power behind that, because you're already saying, hey, we're going in lockstep here. Like we agree on how this needs to be done, and we're working together on whatever those challenges are. So Enzo, from your perspective, I mean, the IHSA has been, critical in getting a lot of the recommendations forward to government through the Construction Legislative Review Committee. Can you touch a little bit on sort of the confidence that there is behind those recommendations that go forward when you've got and it only goes forward if there is labor management buy-in. But can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think what's important in our network that provides that value is the number of people involved. And again, from a regional perspective, so you got both labor and management, you've got regional perspective, but I don't think the industry, or sometimes people don't realize that you've got about 1,200 volunteers. That's a big component of the industry that's sitting at the table, giving early input in potentially regulatory proposals. So they're aware that these issues are of concern. So work already starts migrating out there to say, geez, this is a really big issue, folks, that we're working on today. We should almost, before even regulation comes out, we need to get on board. And I'll use the tower crane one, for example. We started the tower crane regulation review and change back in 2008 and was developed it was a very difficult and complex process involving the industry, operators, the engineering industry, consultants, the government. And it took until about 2014 to finish the proposal. The regulation didn't come into effect until about 2020, 2021, I think it was. But the industry already made the changes because they were at the table. They knew what was required for improvement, and they can implement those process changes immediately. Didn't have to wait for regulation. And that spread out across the province as well. And that's typically what happens when you have such a big network of dedicated folks. They're all volunteers. They have their regular work, but they take away the benefits of understanding what those proposals are about and are able to start to implement immediately. So I think that's another really important element of an early engagement and early input is the industry's alerted and is aware and can make some changes immediately. They're not stagnant.
That's actually a really good point, Enzo. I just want to strengthen that a little bit. Word gets out, right? People start talking, the industry starts talking, and it gives us the opportunity to test, to pilot, to experiment in a safe environment, to challenge those assumptions we talked about. Sorry to interrupt, Enzo. It's just good point you bring up.
It's something that we've seen year over years, right? That certainly the regulatory piece is important because then it becomes a final level playing field. And I think the industry, Marc and Robert, you can certainly attest to a level playing field is an important element when it comes to doing certain things. So there's no advantage, right? Like health and safety shouldn't be necessarily something that people will leverage for an advantage. It needs to be shared. And when there's a regulation that's out there, that's finalized. Now everybody's on the same page. Everyone's in the same level playing field, and they're all moving together for the benefit of the worker, at the same time. So I think that's another important element is it does create a level playing field when you have good policy and regulations put into place.
And I do, I love that concept where, you've got the industry who's leading that change. They're able to jump on board early and just kind of say, hey, we're going to go over, above and beyond. There's no risk at that point, right? Like when you're doing better than what the current regulation has in place and you've already got that momentum moving, by the time that regulation comes in, it's done, right? And when we take a look at sort of the tower cranes, I like that you brought that up because that was going to be sort of my next example for sort of the sort of final question that I'm going to kind of take you guys through. But the reality is some of these changes and some of these working groups and that sort of stuff, it can be messy, especially when you're dealing with something that is really complicated. And tower cranes is a great example of that. You were taking an industry from ultimately sort of a bit of a dinosaur type piece of equipment, sort of a thing, very low tech, into something where, hey, there's new standards, that sort of stuff that have to be implemented, which is very costly to the industry. There are sweeping impacts to the industry. I mean, you look at most buildings out there and, they're using a tower crane, especially when you're dealing with urban environments and that sort of stuff. You've got tower cranes all over the place. I think at last count, there was 275 in the province of Ontario when the new regulations were coming into place. So you think about sort of the impact of that kind of thing. And in that particular example, having been on the enforcement side, and unfortunately, I was the guy who was kind of there as it was coming in, there were some challenges that were with it. But the relationship that we had at the Section 21 committee with the industry was such that we could build working groups and we could work our way through some of those problems. And it was that open dialogue that allowed for some flexibility where the industry couldn't necessarily adapt as quickly as we thought it should have been able to from the regulatory standpoint. So we were able to shift things. We had that relationship where we could say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to hold off on enforcing certain parts of this regulation. We're going to implement them a little bit further down the line. We're going to undertake sort of a bit of a, kind of an education campaign during that time to bring people up to speed. But more importantly, what came out of that was a really comprehensive manual that the government, labor, and management all worked on. And I think this thing's like 120 pages. Like, this is not small stuff, but they worked on it in an effort to get the whole province on board. So everybody is working to the same standard. There is no excuse for kind of non-compliance going forward because we all work together on that same understanding. And I think that's the real value behind this kind of stuff. So, my last and sort of final question for you folks is success stories. So from an advisory capacity where you guys have been involved, what have you seen? Where has that success been? So give me an example, Mark.
Well, I mentioned earlier about the Infrastructure for Jobs Prosperity Act, where Infrastructure Ontario was piloting five projects that would require that all apprentices on the project would be duly registered in an approved training program. There were pieces in there that were brought forward around health and safety, and as well around creating training and employment opportunities for the communities in which the work is taking place in an effort to maximize the return on the investment. So whereas these dollars could do double duty by creating these training and employment opportunities for the professional, administrative, and technical careers that come out of these infrastructure investments, and as well as the supply chain, construction supply chain, and as well the trades work that happens inside the site. So that's an example. More recently, there's been ad hoc construction industry advisory group, the formation of a tripartite labor resource council. These entities that bring together, in most cases, they're a three-way intersection where we're working with the owner community, our employer partners, and labor. And in those cases, there's strategic partnerships around improving project certainty, improving project stability, understanding how is it that we can manage a mega project. It's one thing to talk about the price tag of the project, but Enzo had made some comments earlier about the duration of the project. And projects that span multiple bargaining cycles ought to be prioritized to putting in place industry best practices to provide for project certainty. And in terms of where labor is, or where we used to be, let's say, in terms of a top 10 project risk, we at one point may not even have made that list. And now it's closer to the top 3, if it's not in some cases in the top 2. And so that yesteryear way of thinking that let's get all the project planned and that's done. And, we got to go and engage labor. That's okay. They'll figure it out. You know, the thinking that there's 200 welders hanging on meat hooks in the basement of the union hall, that's over. Where we are now is on a trade by trade with precision, when, how many, and for how long. And in terms of how it is that we are able to share that data, we need trust. We need, obviously we need that buzzword, Robert, collaboration. And it's that continual pursuit of professionalizing the way it is that we plan the work and planning the work together to deliver projects safely, on time, and on budget.
That's a great example. You know, you look at that and you go, you very clearly identified a problem, sort of that labor supply, that sort of stuff. And ultimately you're looking at it saying, how do we make all these projects successful without creating a vacuum behind it where other people are suffering? It's really collectively looking at that issue and saying, how do we all work closer together? How do we build those agreements in between so that we can make sure that we've got the right supply of folks out there? So yeah, no, I think that's great. Robert, what's an example for you?
Oh, I've been making some notes as we go along here. First of all, Mark, great point. It has been so cool to see the entire industry and how we have all worked together with our partners to address this issue of potential labor shortages and what we can do to stimulate that. It's I think it's been really neat to see. Also, before I get into actually answering your question, Brian, I got to give a plug to IHSA, back to that comment on tower cranes. Leverage your associations. They just do a phenomenal job at creating content and resource and support and training and knowledge to understand what's coming, when it's coming, how you can prepare. So Enzo, got to give you guys a little plug there for sure. For me, the greatest success is just this continued shift towards a prevention mindset. Whether it's through standardizing training, the role of the chief prevention officer, introduction of legislation that is focused on protecting before incident, to me has just been huge. It's exactly how it should be. It's exactly how we should all behave. And so for me, that's been what I like to see the most.
Well, and I think it's, whether you're talking prevention or you're talking future planning kind of thing, it's, regardless of the type of counsel that's out there, it's really trying to kind of look at it and say, how do we put the right protections in place to make sure that we're successful with whatever we're dealing with? And you just can't do that alone. It is something that requires everybody's perspective coming in to really understand where those problems, where those pain points are going to be so that you can proactively address them, right? From the prevention perspective, absolutely. I mean, that's where we need to be. It's dealing with a problem after it's happened is not the situation we want to be in. So it's a matter of really kind of putting those cards on the table and saying, hey, this is what we've got to deal with. Let's address it before it becomes a problem. Enzo, your thoughts?
Yeah.
What are some examples where you've seen some real success?
Well, I think the fact that labor and management's been working together for nearly 60 years, I think I want to give shout out to labor and management overall, because that's not a fly by night process, right? That's something that's been committed to, dedicated in making it work. And they've seen certainly the value in doing so, which has led to it continuing for almost 60 years. So I think that's the first and foremost success, is the trust that, and we're very proud to be part of that because we're facilitating the two groups together. So that to me is a big success that I'm hoping the government continues to rely on when it comes to policy and proposals and development of new regulatory or legislative requirements, because it is thorough. It's regional, again, right across the provinces. So that's a big success. And I think seeing That process work also with the coroner's office and the death review committee, certainly something that provides, as the coroner's inquest process has changed, now it's going to more of a labor and management input on recommendations versus a jury, right? To provide insights and input into unfortunate situations where you're looking again for prevention opportunities. So that's another example of where it's kind of moved forward into with the coroner. I'll even throw out Canadian Standards Association. You know, we develop all kinds of new standards across the country. And that's, again, is a process that engages labor, management, government, manufacturers, and general interest parties like ourselves as an association. So you've got 5 parties there that work, and that's the matrix they use. So shout out to CSA because it's a matrix that is sound. It's built on trust, and good things happen, whether it's hard hat standards, respiratory protection, fall protection standards, ladder standards, suspended access platform standards, right? Those things are all are necessary for the industry, and it builds trust in whatever comes out as a standard has been well developed, well thought, and then well received in the end of it. So those are some success stories, including, again, all those other proposals around asbestos regulatory changes, confined space changes, everything that's been done through the years. We're proud of the work that both labor and management have done on it, and the government for being a participant in it as well, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, it's that voice at the table, right? When you look at all those, there is that commonality. You've got that voice at the table. You've got the experts. You've got people who are bringing up the real issues behind it. So whether you're dealing with CSA, you're dealing with the construction death review committee, the Section 21, whatever the story is, it's those experts who are sitting around the table whose voice is being heard. And I got to tell you, I mean, it's having spent years on the Section 21 committee as the government representative, I was always blown away by how cohesive the group was. I mean, there were certainly disagreements that happened at the table on that sort of stuff, but everybody's position was respected and everybody got that opportunity to voice their concerns, which I always thought was something that, it's something that's 100% worth noting, because that is kind of that safe space where everybody can kind of voice their concerns saying, hey, listen, I got a real problem with this, because if you do that, this part of the business is going to suffer, kind of thing. Or if you do this, this particular trade is going to be disadvantaged or something along those lines, right? And it was something where you could work through those problems in a very productive way versus having something thrust upon you and now you have to adapt. And that's where I think that advisory committee really becomes really important, is you are helping to build it versus having to find a way to adapt to it. And I think that's where the real difference is.
And
So-
I'll kind of throw one more comment that it was an observer in one of our Section 21 committees, and they turned around and said to me, I don't know who labor and who management are in this room.
Yeah.
The way that everyone's talking, there is no indication as to what party they represent, which is fantastic. And that's kudos to the industry, because that's what they bring into it. Leave the hat at the door, come in, let's look for prevention initiatives and work together on it. Whether it's this or whether it's, to your point, labor requirements and all that, it works better when you look at the outcome you're trying to achieve, and not forget about, but certainly don't focus on what your personal perspective is. Look at the end goal.
Yeah. It's so I participated on the labor management, regional labor management committees coming up through the government. And I remember my first Section 21 committee meeting, and it was intimidating. Like I walked into that thing, geez, I don't know what I'm getting myself into as sort of the government representative. And I got to tell you, it was probably about 5 minutes of being sort of uncomfortable, and you got talking to folks, and it was this wildly collaborative environment where I went, geez, this is like, I was really worried for nothing kind of thing. And it really was just this thing, whereas, man, you are preaching to the converted. People are there, they're bought in, they want to solve problems. That's really what that comes down to. So
that's such a good point, right? We all want the same thing.
Yeah.
We want a meaningful industry that employs and protects workers, that delivers projects that are practical, on time, on budget, cost effective. That we're all working towards the same goal.
We are. Yeah, absolutely. It's an evolution right across the board, and we get better every day. And the best way to do that is all of us together, for sure. So, gentlemen, with that, I would like to thank you guys very much for coming onto the podcast. your insight and expertise within the industry is really invaluable. It's something that is absolutely required. It contributes to kind of this industry getting better every day. So I thank you very much for that. For our listeners, so I brought Marc, Robert, and Enzo on today to reinforce the value of industry input into government direction, as well as kind of that legislative and regulatory amendment side of things. I think that we can't really understate the importance of that enough. So my hope is that our listeners help to reinforce the importance of that collective voice to our elected leaders, really with the goal of helping to shape effective legislation that improves our industry, that really makes us better right across the board. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. For more information on today's podcast and resources from the Ontario Construction Secretariat, visit our website at iciconstruction.com and follow us on social media.
Ontario Construction Secretariat. Knowledge to build on. Visit iciconstruction.com to learn more.